All right, Laird Henkel from the California Department of Wildlife and Fish is going to be speaking next about the basis for why we do wildlife rehabilitation. Laird, if you could share that fun fact about you, that'd be great.
So yeah, fun fact. Sorry, yeah, I'm not a barrel racer. Hold on, let's see. There we go. My hobbies include sailing and surfing. Maybe I'll try barrel racing at some point. Okay, so as we heard from Rhonda before lunch, welcome back from lunch, everyone. As we heard from Rhonda before lunch, we learned a little bit about how we care for oiled wildlife. And so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the basis for why we might want to clean oiled wildlife. And when I'm talking about wildlife, for the purpose of this talk, I'm really just talking about birds. Let me know at any time if you can't hear me, okay, or if there's any other technical problems. So a lot of what I'm talking about here is actually in a paper we published last year. This paper is an open access paper available in the Journal of Fish and Wildlife Management. So if you want to learn more, you can look up this paper. There's the URL for it there. And I want to acknowledge my co-author on that paper, Mike Zaccardi from the Oiled Wildlife Care Network at the University of California, Davis, here in California. Okay, so after major oil spills, after many significant oil spills that affect wildlife, a debate tends to arise in the media and sometimes among scientists and responders about whether rehabilitation of oiled wildlife is a good idea or if it's just a waste of time and money. So the arguments from these critics generally boils down to these birds that we rehabilitate are just going to be released and die anyway, so it's a total waste of time. So in this talk, I'm hopefully going to dispel that myth to some extent. All right, so first, the question of why we respond at all to oiled wildlife. The first somewhat obvious answer to that is an ethical responsibility. I think most of us would agree that if there's an anthropogenic impact, like an oil spill that's affecting animals, that we have an ethical responsibility to do something to minimize the suffering of those animals. Next reason to respond, so these are reasons to respond and not just leave the animals out there on their own. Next reason to respond at all would be human safety. So if we don't have a coordinated and cohesive and robust response to oiled wildlife, in many cases, members of the public are not going to be happy about that and will actually go out and attempt to collect the oiled wildlife themselves. So that's not great for the birds, and it's definitely not good for the people. It's certainly a human safety issue. And then finally, in terms of response to oiled wildlife, there is a legal mandate. So after the Exxon Valdez spill in 1989 in Alaska, the Oil Pollution Act of 1990 was enacted, abbreviated here as OPA 90. And OPA 90 said, dictated that oil spill contingency plans in the US must provide for coordinated, immediate, and effective protection, rescue, and rehabilitation, and minimization of risk of injury to fish and wildlife resources and habitat. So there actually is a legal mandate within the US to at least attempt rehabilitation of wildlife. Okay, so these were reasons why we are going to go out and do something with oiled wildlife. So then the next question is, if we're collecting these animals, why not just euthanize them, put them out of their misery right away, save a lot of money? So answers to that include, there's not really a financial argument to euthanize rather than rehabilitate. So this is one argument that critics make, is that we should use the funds for rehabilitation for something else that's going to benefit those species. So a couple points. One, the cost of wildlife rehabilitation is actually typically a very small percentage of the overall response costs. So response to oil spills is very expensive, but the wildlife component is typically less than 5% of the total. So there's a previous paper by Greg Massey on that topic. And then perhaps more importantly, the money that is spent on wildlife rehabilitation is totally separate from the money spent on restoration. And we're going to hear more about restoration this afternoon. But we can't magically take the money that would be spent on wildlife rehabilitation during an actual spill response and spend that on some other benefit for those species. Then the next reason to not euthanize is a continuing ethical responsibility. So building earlier on the simple ethical responsibility to do something, some people would also argue that animals have intrinsic value and that animals have an intrinsic right to be alive rather than be euthanized. And then finally, I'm going to focus the rest of this talk on post-release survival. So again, many critics would claim that once these animals are cleaned and released, survival is very low, and thus it's a waste of time. But in fact, we've found that, especially in the last 20 years, survival of cleaned and rehabilitated birds after oil spills is quite good. And so I'm going to be talking about some studies that have looked at post-release survival since 1995. 1995 was the last time a review paper was published by Brian Sharp, reviewing at that time what was known about post-release survival. And post-release survival at that time was quite low, and we have made improvements to wildlife rehabilitation techniques since then. And particularly one that Rhonda mentioned was pre-wash stabilization. So stabilizing animals' health before washing. If you go back 30 years or so, that was less common. So just before getting into the studies, some of the methods that are typically used for studying post-release survival. One is banding studies. So this is a picture here of a brown pelican's legs. On the right leg is a metal Fish and Wildlife Service or USGS band. On the left leg is a plastic band with a unique identifier and a color. So these bands allow researchers from a distance to identify that bird and determine that it is in fact still alive. So that would be resighting bands on live birds is a technique widely used for studying post-release survival, as well as recovery of bands on carcasses of birds that die. Another method is radiotelemetry or any kind of telemetry tracking. So radiotelemetry would be attaching a VHF radio transmitter to a bird and then tracking it with a radio telemetry receiver. Could also use something like a satellite tag, which just sends data directly to a satellite, or other types of tags. So these allow researchers to get more specific fine scale data. Oh, sorry, I'm hearing an echo there. Let me just...
There's no echo on our end.
Let me just mute my speaker so I can't hear you for a minute. Okay, so hopefully there's no problems there. If there are, I think you're just gonna have to wait to the end. Radiotelemetry allows researchers to get finer scale data, typically shorter term. Batteries on most of these units last only a year or so. And then for any study of post-release survival, we would want to be able to look at the oiled, cleaned, and rehabilitated birds against a control population or a reference population of unoiled birds. And just to clarify, I'm talking here about post-release survival, not survival during the rehab process. So that's a different topic that is an important topic, but relatively few studies have actually been published on that topic, and I don't have time to get into it in this talk. Here in California, we have found that survival of birds coming into rehab and then being able to release is well over 50%. And then also I'm not focusing here on whether or not the birds that have been rehabilitated re-enter the breeding population. Again, there's relatively few studies on that, although several studies have found that birds can, after oil spills and rehabilitation, can rejoin the breeding population. So I'm just focusing on survival here. Okay, so the first study, I'm going to go through just 7 studies quite briefly. First study is Whittington looked at African penguins in South Africa. This was a long-term study over many different spills. And in this study, band recovery, it was a band, mostly band recite project. And overall survival of oiled and rehabilitated birds was no different than survival of unoiled birds. Next, Altwegg and others looked at Cape Gannets in South Africa after a spill in 1983. This was also a banding study, long-term, about 15 years. And again, survival was almost the same. Survival of rehab birds was about 97 to 98% that of unoiled birds. Goldsworthy and others looked at little penguins in Tasmania after a spill in 1995. This was also a banding study, although shorter term. In this case, survival of rehab birds was about 77 to 80% that of unoiled birds. Anderson and others in 2000 looked at American coots oiled at a spill here in California in 1995. This was a telemetry project, so it was relatively short term, less than a year. In this case, survival of oiled birds was only about 50% that of unoiled birds. Golightly and others looked at survival of western gulls after a spill in California in 1997. Again, it was a telemetry study and short term, less than a year. But in this case, there was no difference in survival of rehab and unoiled birds. De la Cruz and others looked at survival of surf scoters in California after the Costco-Bazan spill in 2007. This was also a telemetry project, short term, only about 4 months. And this of the batch was the lowest survival. Survival of oiled birds was only about 29% that of unoiled birds tracked. Sievwright looked at survival of little blue penguins in New Zealand after the Rena spill in 2011. This was a slightly different study. It was a microchip tracking study. So these birds had pit tags implanted subcutaneously in their backs and then were monitored at nesting sites for 2 years. And in this case, there was no difference in survival of unoiled and oiled birds. And then finally, getting to studies that you all are probably familiar with, or I should say y'all are most probably familiar with and interested in, survival of brown pelicans after the Deepwater Horizon spill. So these studies focused on birds released. So of 612 pelicans cleaned and released after Deepwater Horizon, 182 were relocated to Rabbit Island, west of the spill area. And these studies focus on band resites at Rabbit Island of those pelicans, 1 month and 1 year after relocation. So in both cases, 1 month and 1 year after the spill, there was no difference in resites of rehab resites of rehab birds and unoiled birds. So just to summarize briefly those post-release survival studies, as you saw, survival in those studies was variable, but in many cases there was no difference in survival of cleaned and rehabilitated birds and control unoiled birds. So the table on the right there just shows the breakdown. 5 of those 8 studies showed basically no difference in survival, and so only 3 of the studies, well, only 1 study had survival less than 50%, 2 studies 50 to 95%. So the variability there could be related to a number of different factors. It could depend on species. So among species, you might have noticed that penguins, survival of penguins seemed quite high. That seems intuitive based on their robust body shape and their plumage. And various other species may not fare so well. So that points in the direction of more research that would help us figure out why those species that don't do well are not doing as well. So other factors can include weather, spilled product, speed of the response, etc. So speed of the response could be important. As we heard this morning from Kendall, there can be substantial internal effects of oil on birds, and those internal effects are going to come from those birds preening oil off their feathers and ingesting it. So if we collect oiled wildlife and clean them quickly, there's much less chance for them to preen oil off themselves and ingest it. So speed of response can be important. So just to summarize overall, reasons why we want to respond to oiled wildlife in some capacity are an ethical responsibility, human safety issues, and a federal legal mandate. And then reasons to attempt to rehabilitate wildlife rather than just euthanizing them are that there's no real financial argument against rehabilitation. There is an additional ethical responsibility to try to rehabilitate birds. And post-release survival is expected, in many cases, to be reasonable. I should mention that euthanasia is always a response option. So birds that are in rehab, many of those will get euthanized as the responsible, best achievable care for those animals determined by the veterinarians, maybe euthanasia. But in many cases, these birds will survive, so rehabilitation is at least worth a try. So just want to thank you all for being there, and want to thank Gulf Sea Grant and others for putting on this great workshop. I want to thank my organization, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, our close partners, the Oiled Wildlife Care Network at UC Davis, and all of the rehab groups that work to rehabilitate oiled wildlife, including International Bird Rescue and Sand Cobb in South Africa, among others. So thanks.